Welcome back, everybody, to another Malazan video. That is not the Crippled God update that you might have been expecting. That one's coming later. Nope. Instead, I want to talk about something else. One thing that I feel we often fail to appreciate enough in our Malazan discussions here on YouTube or wherever. So I figured I'll just do that for today. We're going to talk a bit about what the world building of Malazan brought to fantasy that wasn't there that much before. And this will obviously include spoilers for the Malazan universe, although there won't be any like plot specific spoilers. So if you're fine with that kind of spoilery things, you can totally stay on. And if not, there will be spoilers that go beyond Guardians of the Moon. But this is like more of an analysis, so having read some of those books will certainly help you in any case. And without further ado, let's actually get into this. Cheers. All right, so what I want to do is look at a little bit of fantasy literature in general, and then at what the Malazan Book of the Fallen, or the Malazan world in general. So both Esselmont and Erickson both did with the world and brought something new, or maybe not new, but something old back to the table and opened the gates for stuff that has hopefully changed. I mean, it has certainly changed since the first Malazan book was published. It may have changed even more, and I'm not aware of it because I don't read that much of like self-published fantasy, and I feel there's more of that going on there. So, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the fact that a lot of fantasy literature, classic fantasy literature, epic fantasy literature, has always been a very, very conservative genre, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, a lot of fantasy readers have also always been very conservative people when it comes to their fantasy tastes. What do I mean? Well, on the one hand, I mean that at least like the major, like mainstream epic fantasy that came from Tolkien, but not only from Tolkien, also from Robert E. Howard. Not so much from Leiber or Clark Ashton Smith. Those are sort of the examples, same as Jack Vance, that go in a different direction. But a lot of your classic fantasy has like always limited itself to a very, very narrow part of our imagination when it comes to world building, which is a shame when we're talking about a genre that has the word fantasy in its title already, right? But when you look at it, obviously Tolkien took his inspiration from mythology, mostly Norse mythology, the Finnish mythology, like Western and Northern European mythology, mostly. And that's fine and good, because obviously he was doing something pretty new at the time. So that's fine. The problem is that we kind of stuck there. When we look at what I meant, Robert E. Howard, though I really love a lot of his writings, when it comes to world building, since he's actually set his stuff, his stories, most of those on planet Earth in fictional like previous ages of the world, he also stayed fairly down to earth when it came to like his imagination. He just gave it like new names and changed small bits, but he basically wanted, as I've said before, Howard actually wanted to write historical fiction without having to argue with actual history buffs at the time about getting details wrong. So he just called, his medieval Europe Aquilonia, and and then he could do whatever the fuck he wanted. So yeah, there's that, and that kind of stayed with it, and it also stayed a long time. It also stayed that way with very few exceptions throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and even like really early 2000s when you look at what was popular fantasy at the time. Your Tad Williams, Memory, Sorrow, Thorn, while having pretty cool world building as far as I remember, it was still like a basically medieval, pseudo-medieval pseudo-European world with some, additional bits and pieces tacked on, but mostly that. Same goes for obviously George R. R. Martin, Game of Thrones. What he did wasn't really revolutionary. He just, took the sort of gritty, pseudo realism from fantasy and tagged it onto a pseudo medieval, pseudo European world. That's basically it. And Joe Abercrombie also took like almost caricatures of also like Western, mostly Western cultures, with the exception of the Gurkish, who are a caricature of an Oriental culture, and added his like laconic, dry sense of humor and brilliant dialogue to it. Which don't get me wrong, I like those books. But when it comes to world building, they're pretty limited and pretty down to earth. Even Robin Hobb's first trilogy, the Farseer trilogy, and I like that one, but it's still this like sort of medieval, Mediterranean, and Western European world with like sometimes a few bits added on to that, but that's basically what it is. Oftentimes, you could even tell that it's like more like a picture book kind of Europe, how people who are not, who have not grown up in Europe or with a more detailed knowledge of European medieval history, how they imagine Europe, which, it's something you also see a lot when you go to that other big influence of a lot of like more like modern fantasy, not modern fantasy, but what was like successful in the 80s and 90s, which is that whole thing that comes from the Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role-playing game background. You read your, I don't know, Forgotten Realms novels. I mean, don't do that. They're terrible. They suck. Um, or read your Dragonlance novels. That's all basically this Western pseudo medieval world. When we look at cultures that are not pseudo European, we quickly encounter a lot of problematic, colonialist, orientalist depictions of stuff there. Um, there's obviously some few exceptions out there. Technically, Glenn Cook's Black Company doesn't have that European setting. Well, not so much once he gets out of the ladies' realm, I guess. Although, once again, his world building is so vague that it's very difficult to say anything about it. Um, you know, but the big players always had a fairly down to earth, approach to world building. It's you take the some kind of culture or a country or place, a bit of geography that you know from our world. You go ahead and maybe add dragons or add magic or one other bit that you find interesting, and that's about it. Like, I don't know, I've not read the entirety of Sanderson or the entirety of Robert Jordan, but what I read from Jordan is also fairly basic, pseudo medieval, pseudo European world building. And as I said, there's nothing wrong with it, in as such. There obviously is something wrong with it when you realize that for a long time that's more or less the only flavor of fantasy you get. Then at some point you get some more like other fantasy books coming out that then focus on some pseudo medieval, like, or equivalent in that case, period in Japanese history or Chinese history, and add some bits from their mythology and stuff like that. But we still basically, define, or not define, but subconsciously defined fantasy worlds mostly as, a pseudo medieval parallel to our world with magic or one or two other cool gimmicks. And whether that, yeah, and that has been the case, or used to be the case, for a long time. Now obviously you add the idea that in that time we were still in the age of traditional publishing, so You need to sell your book to a publisher who wants to make money with that. So he's 10, like most of those publishers are big publishing companies who are by nature risk averse and will probably buy something that is similar to the stuff they already sell or know is selling. So it's kind of understandable. But that's sort of the point that I made. It's like we as readers of fantasy got fairly conservative because that was mostly what we got to read was these like pseudo medieval and fantasy. The idea of fantasy as a fantastic book got for a large part shrunk down to that very small corner of what you might call fantastic, the fantastic, because we're talking about books here. We have unlimited super special effects budgets when writing stories, right? We can do whatever the fuck we want because we only need to find words for it. And this is where I come to the point where I see that the Malazan world, as such, did something incredible because Malazan Book of the Fallen is still traditionally published. But the Malazan world does do away with a lot of that. And it goes in both directions. And this is the amazing bit there. It goes in both directions. It actually gets world building right on a scale, on a level of detail that is pretty unique up to this point. But it also gets the fantastic right. I make jokes about this like this is some parts of the Malazan world feel like they're written by a 5-year-old in a positive way because that's the other bit there. We remember, I guess most of us, at least me and most people that I know, is like when we think back on what was possible in our games, or freeform games and stories we made up in our heads when we were kids, those limitations weren't there, right? They weren't there. We were playing with dinosaurs and lasers and swords and all kinds, and spaceships and all kinds of other stuff all at the same time, and it all fitted seamlessly in our minds. And at some point that got lost, and fantasy suddenly is just guys with swords on horses. And one dude with a pointy hat and a knob at the a staff with a knob on the end. And yeah, that's kind of sad, but Malazan does away with all of that. And this is the thing that I wanted to point out today is like the level of awesome and just like let's do it because it's amazing that you find in the Malazan world is breathtaking and I guess kicked open the doors not so much in the imagination of fantasy writers. I'm pretty sure there have always been fantasy writers that had no such problems when it came to their imagination, but it certainly, I guess, helped kick open the doors for fantasy readers and publishers to see that this kind of thing can also be sold. I mean, I mean, obviously, something like Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun has also a pretty unique world building. Even that one is rather down to earth, which may just be the case because it takes place on Earth. But I, as a 5-year-old kid, would have loved dinosaurs with swords, and they are fucking cool. So why not include them in our world, in our fantasy world? And I would also have loved dinosaurs with lasers. So why not include them? Why not have an undead army that can fall to dust? Why not have floating mountains and people that shoot fireballs down from them? Why not, have gigantic green hands come out of the earth? Or almost like even gigantic green jade, in this case, creatures, humans show up. Why not have it rain blood and all these things? We're talking fantasy. The imagination is the limit, or should be the limit. And it's something that you see in the Malazan Book of the Fallen and in the novels of the Malazan Empire, because the Malazan world has all of these fantastic things that just, we don't get anywhere else. It's like, yeah, well, let's just, flood an entire world. That's possible. That can happen. Why not have a floating city? Just float on water and then fall through a portal and crash down in the middle of the steps. Yeah, I would have my 5-year-old self would have loved it. My now much older self still loves the freedom that brings, the freedom of imagination that we find in those world building elements of the Malazan world. And yeah, the other side of that is that because the world building is done with such meticulous detail, these weird or more fantastic elements fit seamlessly with the cultures. And it's like, I was thinking about it, it's like there's so little medieval European elements in the Malazan world. Like, the Malazan Empire is not exactly a medieval empire. It's more akin to the Roman Empire. The Empire of Lether is almost like early Renaissance, I would say, in a way, or maybe Byzantine, if you want to look that way. But you have all these, it's all over the place. It's not medieval. It kind of shows that you can build a world and make this world in itself extremely consistent from, like, continental bits and all the way up. Make it in itself consistent and still avoid being another just medieval European, pseudo-European Western world. And that's my point for today here, is that when we talk about the literary skill of Esselmont or Erickson, when we talk about all these things, when we analyze, or when someone like the Critical Dragon goes and analyzes the first, like, half page of a book in like 40 minutes and goes through that, we appreciate the writing skill. We appreciate the writing skill brought to the table by people like Stephen Erickson and Ian Cameron Esselmont. But we often kind of fail to point out how impressive their achievement as world builders was, and how revolutionary in a way for, like, mainstream best-selling epic fantasy. And as I said, things have slowly changed since then, but it still is a pretty unique world that has a lot of things we usually don't see. It's like, how many other fantasy books just blow up the moon because they can? It's like, that's pretty cool. And yeah, while we often take Malazan very seriously, and I think that's a good thing, and I extremely appreciate all of these aspects of the Malazan world and the Malazan Book of the Fallen and the novels of the Malazan Empire very much. Today I just wanted to say, maybe we should sometimes just sit back and say, wow, dinosaurs with swords fighting dinosaurs with lasers while there's floating mountains overhead and the moon has just exploded. Fucking awesome. And with that, I'll leave you for now, and I'll talk to you later about the Crippled God. Until then, cheers.